Welcome back to episode 30 of our podcast. Last time we talked about Japanese court music as well as wrapping up the French overture. Today we're going to continue in the Baroque period, but this time transfer from instrumental music over to Baroque vocal music. So let's jump in. Vocal music, or music for solo voices, chorus, or both, formed a major part of the output of virtually all Baroque composers. We have seen that composers were supported by three main institutions: the church, the opera house, and the court. Each of these demanded vocal music. Indeed, of the three, only the court was a major source of instrumental music, and every court had its chapel, for which the court composers were also required to provide vocal music. Courts had their own opera houses, too. Theories of musical expression in the Baroque era were touched on previously. It was believed at the time that emotions could be isolated, categorized, and listened in a fairly simple way, and that music could enhance or even arouse each emotion by means of certain musical devices applied consistently, even single-mindedly, throughout a piece. Theorists developed checklists of musical devices corresponding to each of the effects, as they called emotions conceived in this way. It was particularly in vocal music, where the words sung define or suggest a specific emotion, that this music vocabulary of emotions was applied most consistently. If a text refers to rejoicing, for example, a Baroque composer would almost inevitably match it with fast, lively runs. A mention of victory would probably require trumpets and drums to evoke battle music. More literally, when a text speaks of high or low, a setting in high or low voices is likely, and so on. So let's look at the first genre of vocal music, opera. The principal genre of secular vocal music of the Baroque era was opera. Introduced around the year 1600, opera flourished mightily all over Europe and soon became the most glamorous and probably the most adventurous and influential artistic genre of the Baroque era. In characterizing the emotional world of Baroque art, we stressed its theatrical quality. The Baroque was fascinated by the theater, and especially by opera, the ultimate multimedia experience of its day, combining poetry, drama, music, vocal virtuosity, scenic splendor, dance, and more. Spectacular singing was of the essence in Baroque opera, and so was spectacular stage architecture featuring amazing transformation scenes and the like. Systems of pulleys and counterweights could rapidly change the set from a palace to a magic garden, with gods and goddesses descending from the heavens in a fiery chariot. Opera offered a wealth of satisfactions, then, most obviously no doubt, for the vocal connoisseurs of the day, the fans of great singers. They are said to have gossiped and played cards in the boxes while waiting for their favorite to sing their special arias. The opera world was very different back then. Back then, if people didn't like what you did, they would boo. That it wasn't go to the opera house and be quiet and behave yourself and go home and say that was a great outing. You expected to be entertained. But opera's ability to project emotion was the real basis of its appeal. First and foremost, opera erected a stage on which individual singers could step forward to express feelings in the most direct and powerful fashion. Since the singers were portraying actual characters in a drama, they were repeatedly thrown into situations which made it natural for them to experience and express intense emotions. Such emotions were intensified, of course, by music. Emotions could be intensified by great vocal virtuosity, too. The most obvious kind of vocal curiosity is coloratura singing. Fast, brilliant runs, scales, high notes, vocal cadenzas, and so on, stressing technique for its own sake. But the legendary singers of old moved their audiences not only by singing faster than anyone else, but by singing more beautifully, more delicately, and more emotionally. There are different types of opera. We're going to start by looking at Italian opera seria, or serious opera in Italian. The principal type of Italian Baroque opera was opera seria, or serious opera. The plots, mostly derived from ancient history with all kinds of alterations and additions, were designed to stir up powerful emotions, such as passion, rage, grief, and triumph. This gave the singers many opportunities to excel in one kind of expression or another. Opera seria consists mainly of solo singing by sopranos and mezzo-sopranos, including castratos, which we'll talk about very soon. Tenors and basses play subordinate roles. There are few duets or choruses in this style of opera. The text of an opera is called the libretto, which is short for little book, and the author of the text is the librettist. Librettists were required to build up the drama as a whole, form a series of texts or recitatives and arias. So, we've spoken about recitative and aria briefly before. Let's touch on them one more time. Recitative, from the Italian word for recite, is a technique of declaiming words musically in a heightened theatrical manner. There is always an instrumental accompaniment with recitative. The singing voice closely follows the free rhythms of emotional speech. It mirrors and indeed exaggerates the natural ups and downs that occur as an actor raises his or her voice at a question, lowers it in asides, or cries out in distress. The composer makes no effort to organize these speech-like utterances into real melodies. Recitative was used for plot action, dialogue, and other places in the drama where it is particularly important for the words to be brought out. Texts, phrases, and individual words are not ordinarily repeated, of course, any more than they would be in speech. Most of the time, recitative accompaniment was kept to a minimum. Basso continuo, cello and harpsichord alone, so that the singer could interpret the dialogue or the action as spontaneously as possible. A name for recitative with continuo accompaniment is secco recitative, from the Italian word secco, meaning dry. Think of the sound of the harpsichord. It is a very dry sound. It doesn't echo. It doesn't linger. In every opera, however, one or two of the most excited, emotion-filled recitatives were provided with orchestral accompaniment of one kind or another. This type is called accompanied recitative. So, secco recitative or dry recitative is the singer and the continuo, and accompanied recitative is the singer with the orchestra. I mentioned a group of people a few moments ago called the castrati or castrato. Intimately tied up with the Italian opera seria was the castrato singer, or more of one is called castrati. The starring male roles in opera were hardly ever sung by tenors or basses, but rather by men who had submitted to castration as young boys in order to preserve their voices in the soprano or alto range. It is at best the castrato voice was a prize virtuoso instrument, more powerful and brilliant than a woman's soprano. Part of why they were so special was because women had voices that could go so much higher than men, and men had the power in their voice that women didn't have. The castrato was able to combine these two things and have the range of a female, but have the power of a male. The practice seems an outrage to us today, as it did to everybody outside of Italy at the time and to many inside of Italy as well. And as it pointed out that for an intelligent peasant boy, the classic way to avoid a lifetime of labor in the fields was to enter the priesthood with its vow of chastity, and that becoming a castrato provided another similar option. In any case, in Italy and all over Europe, France was a notable exception. Castrati were gladly accepted because of their wonderful singing and given top billing, along with women prima donnas. But the presence of frankly unnatural men in the main opera roles, which were of course usually romantic roles, made it very hard to believe in the ideal of opera as serious drama and music. Often it was closer to concert and costume. Contributing to the sideshow quality, it was common for male characters to disguise themselves as women and vice versa. The male soprano voice was used for female impersonation in France. The most famous castrati were international stage figures. They were like our modern-day rock stars. Some were pampered stars and objects of ridicule at the same time, such as Caffarelli, who was once jailed for indecent gestures during an opera performance. Others were serious artists. Carlo Broschi, whose stage name was Farinelli, the most famous of all, was also a composer and later in life an influential figure at the court of Spain. Many more castrati worked out of the limelight in Italian churches. The last known castrato, a member of the Sistine Choir in Rome, made a recording in 1902. The voice has been described as penetrating and curiously disembodied. For a 1990 film about Farinelli, a virtual castrato voice was invented by digital wizardry. So, we talked about the recitative. Let's talk about aria before looking at our first example of opera. An aria is a set piece for solo singer that has much more musical elaboration and coherence than a passage of recitative. The vocal part is more melodic, and typically the accompaniment includes the orchestra, not just the continuo. Here the singer-actor is mulling over his or her emotions at some leisure, getting his feelings out instead of reacting moment by moment as in recitative. Consequently, in arias, the repetition of poetic phrases or words is common and, in principle, appropriate. The standard form for the Baroque Italian opera aria is da capo form, ABA, as we've seen over and over, and sometimes, but less frequent, ABA prime. Both the words and music of A are repeated after B. Da capo, the head, is a direction on scores, meaning to repeat from the beginning. The composer wrote the music for A and B only, leaving the performers to do the rest. Indeed, the singer would do more than just repeat A. He or she would also ornament the music with improvised runs, cadenzas, and so on, so as to create an exciting, enhanced effect the second time around. For connoisseurs of the day, a great deal depended on the A repeats, since it was there that the singer really dazzled their audience. Many modern singers have relearned the most improvisational art of the Baroque era, and we can recapture some of the original excitement on recordings. So Let's listen to an example from the opera Julius Caesar, or Giulio Cesare and Egitto, by George Frederick Handel. As a young man, Handel wrote a few German operas for the Hamburg Opera Company. Most of the music is lost, though, and a few Italian operas for theaters in Florence and Venice. In his maturity, he wrote as many as 40 Italian operas for London. Probably the most famous of them is Julius Caesar, one of a trio of Handel masterpieces written in the year 1924 to 1925, the others being Rolinda and Tamerlano. A bit of a background on the opera. Like most opera seria plots of the late Baroque era, Julius Caesar takes its subject from Roman history. Cleopatra, the unprincipled queen of Egypt, applied her formidable charms to Julius Caesar and then, after Caesar's assassination, also to his successor, Mark Antony. Shakespeare deals with the second of these famous affairs, Handel with the first. But Handel's librettist added a great deal of non-historical plot material that Shakespeare would have shaken his head at. History tells that Pompey, who comes into the story because he waged war on Caesar and lost and fled to Egypt, was murdered by his centurion, but in the opera, the murderer is Cleopatra's brother Ptolemy. Pompey's widow Cornelia is thrown into Ptolemy's harem and has to resist his advances, among others. Pompey's son Sextus rattles around the opera, swearing vengeance on Ptolemy, and finally kills him. In actuality, Ptolemy was poisoned by Cleopatra, but her character is whitewashed, and she gets to sing some of the opera's most ravishing music, seductive indeed, while she is disguised as her maid. Although the role of Sextus, for mezzo-soprano, was presumably meant for a castrato, at the first performance it was sung by a woman singer who was one of Handel's regulars. The aria La Giustizia, Sextus promises revenge on Ptolemy, not for the first time, in the aria La Giustizia, which means justice. This aria is preceded, or rather set up, by a recitative, like all arias were. Since it makes more sense to study recitative when the words are in English, we will leave that discussion until we get to Handel's Messiah. The aria starts with a ritornello played by the string orchestra, establishing the mood right away, as we see here. The effect Handel means to cover by this strenuous, vigorous music is anger, and Sextus starts up with the same music. He will hear the ritornello 3 more times, abbreviated 1 time prior to the second A section. Apart from this, La Giustizia is in strict ABA or da capo form. In the A section, Handel goes through the words 3 times, with short ritornellos in between to allow the singer to catch her breath. These short spacers are not marked on the listening chart that you'll see. Notice how the music tends to explode angrily on certain key words, principally by the use of coloratura, which are those fast scales and turns on the word vendetta, vengeance, and traditor, or traitor. Even more vivid are the sudden high notes on punire, for punish, and a suspense-making long note on traditor. There is a flamboyant effect typical of the Baroque near the end of A, where Sextus pauses dramatically for effect. After a breathless fermata, he moves on to make a very forceful final cadence. Revenge is nigh. The aria's B section introduces some new keys for contrast. Otherwise, it is brief and seems rather subdued. The strings drop out, leaving only the continuo as an accompaniment. What the audience is waiting for is the da capo of A, where we can forget about Sextus and get to admire a display of vocal virtuosity. Notice how the singer on our recording adds brilliant improvised flourishes to the high notes on punire and the long note on traditor. When she gets to the dramatic fermata in the first A, she fills it in with a cadenza, and her ornamented final cadence sweeps us away. Anyone who can carry off a feat like this, the aria seems to say, will be more than a match for Ptolemy. Vocal cadenzas at the time were short because they were supposed to be sung in a single breath, thus showing off virtuoso breath control as well as vocal technique and inventiveness. So let's hear La Giustizia from Handel's Julius Caesar. That brings us to the end of this lesson. Next time, we're going to look a little bit more at George Frederick Handel and his contribution to the world of oratorio through Messiah, where we'll look a bit more in depth at Recitative. We'll also look at women in music at the time. After looking at Messiah, we'll look at the church cantata and come back to some Bach examples that we haven't heard in a while. And then finally, the organ chorale before going back to Japan. So, until next time, cheers.